Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Child Psych Podcast. My name is Tammy. I'm a registered child psychologist, a registered play therapist, the co founder of the Institute of Child Psychology, and I'm a mom to three amazing kids. Today, we have with us Rasmussen. She's an acclaimed grief educator and bestselling author of Second Firsts, Where Did You Go? And The Invisible Loss, which is coming out, and we'll talk about that. In 2010, 4 years after her 35-year-old spouse passed away from stage 4 colon cancer, she created the Life Reentry process, which launched her on a mission to bring compassion, grace, and validation to thousands while simultaneously establishing an exit from what she termed the waiting room. Christina holds a master's degree in guidance counseling from the University of Durham. She's currently finishing her Master's of Fine Arts degree in painting and drawing from the Academy of Art. And her grief work has been featured in ABC News and in Women's World, the Washington Post, and the White House blog. So, welcome. It's so nice to see you today.
It's so good to be here, Tammy, and I love how friendly and awesome you are. It just makes this conversation so great. We are so alike, by the way. I
Oh,
just love
beautiful.
it. Yes,
Yeah, we're
thank
both
you.
running private practices out of our homes, but we're talking about clients coming in. Is the doorbell going to ring? Yeah. So you're a grief specialist, which I did.
Yes.
I know clinically, I did a lot of grief work
Yeah.
myself in a past life, not so much now. But I would love to hear just a little bit more about like your specialty and your work with your clients and your published work. Like how I know you may mentioned your husband, but like just tell
Yes.
me a little more about that.
So you know how destiny works and how what's meant to be will be. When I was in my 20s, I was studying my master's in counseling. And when the time came to choose our thesis, I really wanted to know how people recover from such a heartbreak, losing someone they loved so much. How do we ever move on from that? So I did my thesis in grief, in the stages of bereavement. What I didn't know then, that a few years later, my own very young husband would also pass at a very young age, and I was a single parent with two very young kids, 4 and 6 years old. And as I started to come back to my own life, I made a promise to myself that I would go back and get everyone else as long as I got out. I got out of that very devastating cloud that was in my life. And over the years, I wrote, this is my third book, Invisible Loss, and I coined the term the waiting room and invisible loss because I discovered, Tammy, something that blew my mind. My first few years in my classes, we used to have people with very traditional grief, loss of a spouse, loss of a child that would come. And then over the years, as we moved forward, then different people would come along with losses that were not traditionally called tragic. They were not seen as tragic losses. And that's when I realized that it wasn't the tragic losses of our lives that held us back to a place that I call the waiting room or got us stuck in that place. But it was all the things that we never thought were significant or important to be validated and to be seen that actually still to this day keep us back. And when it comes to children, we raise our children in a survival based environment where we are surviving those losses without even knowing. And the way we communicate with them and the way we talk to them and what we are showing to them comes from a survival mindset versus a thriver mindset, a place where we're fulfilled and alive and full of joy. So that's kind of a quick summary of the last
Oh,
14 years of my life.
oh, beautiful. So when you talk about, how we're raising our children, and I know in your work you indicate like stifled self-expression as a
Mhm.
child can lead to like these inner narratives as an adult.
Yes.
That is this part of that grief like that can hold us back, like as we're
Yes.
trying to grieve. Maybe
Yes.
help explain that to me.
So when we are children, we experience devastating moments that from the outside, they don't seem devastating to the parent
Mhm.
or to the other adults. They just seem like the child is having a tantrum. The child is struggling with something today. He doesn't like his food. He's experiencing moments where he's not like himself. But what we don't know in those moments that as children ourselves and our own children are struggling with something and they don't have the words, They don't have, they actually play by themselves and process emotions through that. Uh, but even that changes when they're experiencing what I call the survivor self. That's when the surviving part of us knocks on our doors at a very young age and help us survive. And it, you and Tammy, you can actually start seeing it and noticing it at a very young age when you pay attention to how they cope and how they recover from their day.
Hmm. So I know we see, I'm a play therapist by trade. So
Yes.
one of the things that we do in play therapy is we code play. So it's very common to see grief and loss themes within play when the
Mhm.
child has not experienced a direct quote unquote
Yes.
loss. Like there was no
Thank
death of a
you.
grandparent, the parents
Yes.
weren't divorced,
Yes.
but there is loss of something for them. If it's maybe a loss of connection with someone, like it doesn't mean that person's gone, but maybe they're emotionally unavailable to
Mhm.
them. They lost their, their favorite toy. So sometimes it's like literally they lose something, or they lost a sense of like meaning within the classroom, like in terms of their ability to feel successful, for instance,
Yes.
and to feel competency within the learning environment, that there's a
Yes.
loss kind of that goes with that.
And Tammy, can I say the loss that you just mentioned in the classroom? We had many people, adult individuals in my classrooms that talked about that specific loss, rejection in the classroom, public humiliation at a very young age. And that actually absolutely put them in a trajectory that wasn't true to how they wanted to live their life. It was more true to how to survive and how to avoid moments of rejection.
Mm. Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense too when we think of safety. So, like, I'm a trauma therapist, so everything to me is like neuroception of safety. This is Dr.
Yes.
Stephen Porges' work. And
Yes.
so, to me, like, when you talk about even like a tantrum, when a child is falling apart, because kids fall apart for a variety of reasons, like they got the wrong color of cup, like you told them to go to bed and they want to stay up later, there is an element where kids naturally fall apart. And that's part of a biological process that is
Yes.
needed when they're in grief. Like, there's futility that exists within the environment, right? That they're like, I
Yes.
want this, but I can't have this. This is taken away and it's sad. And I think parents too, if we, it's, this is a beautiful reframe that I've never thought of before, that what you're saying is in those moments when parents maybe can't provide co-regulation, they can't, they're uncomfortable with that child's expression of the
Yes.
grief around what is going on, even though it
Yes.
seems minute,
It's
creates a
not.
feeling of unsafety. And then
Yes.
the grief comes when they're grieving lack of safety, emotional safety with that parent. Is
Very
that the
well
bridge?
said. Very well said, Tammy. And I think you see it. And yes, a lot of people say, Christina, you found the words to describe the thing we see all the time. And if that's the work you do, you will see that loss being expressed in a variety. And I'm getting goosebumps just having this conversation with you, Tammy, because this is what we see over and over again. You mentioned a loss of a toy, the meaning that toy had for that child, the connection to that toy, because they survived with that toy, a moment that was very difficult for them. And when they lose it, it is, I'm so passionate about this. Like you, it is so much more than that loss of a toy. And when as parents, all we've all made that mistake. I mean, I wish I knew then what I know now when I was raising my kids when they're very young. That loss of a toy is so much more. It's a bigger deal. That's our coping mechanism. That's their way of connecting to the world and surviving, which is unfortunately not thriving, not being happy. And then if you take that step to understand what is it about this toy? What is it about this blanket? And listen and pay attention to what the child is saying. I think we'll all raise happier children and happier future adults.
Yeah. Do you feel that if we're to bridge that to a parent's own grief around lack of
Yes.
safety, that's my guess, is we're looking at like,
Yes.
so for instance, like when we
Yes.
think of, I talk about blind spots parents have. This comes from my training with Circle of Security. We call that
Yes.
shark music, where
Yes.
a certain emotion enters the room as a parent, like your child's emotion enters the room. And most emotions you might be able to handle, but then that child will throw an emotion at you over something, it seems mundane, but all
Yes.
of a sudden you are very triggered and you can't hold space for that, so you yell or you ignore them or you tell them to leave the room, or you're snippy, like you're not present, you're
Yes.
reactive to that feeling. And often what I tell parents is, usually if we were to like do a float back in trauma therapy, we call it a float back. If I were to do a float back with you back to your childhood, my guess is that knee jerk response because no one made space for you in that feeling when you were 5 or when you
Yes.
were 7, and you're
Yes.
grieving that. Part of you is saying, this isn't fair, I wasn't allowed to feel that way.
Yes.
And you cannot be, the child in us is not rational. How dare you feel that way? Because
Yes.
I had no voice in that moment, so I don't know how to handle that feeling.
And
Now my
and
child the
yeah,
child shows it.
and why the work needs to start with us, right? And it's we need to go through the, in my book Invisible Loss, I basically have to lay out every step of the way of how to look for our own invisible losses, for our own grief that we experience as a child. That is, and most of the times, Tammy, I'll tell you this, it is not what you think it is,
Mhm.
because that's why I called it invisible. It's completely hidden, not just from everyone else, but from yourself. The child needs help to understand what they're experiencing as well. They're not going to come out and say either. As you know very well, that's why you use play therapy. That's why you use all these different ways. They're not going to come out and say, I'm connecting with this toy and why I'm upset that I lost the toy. They're gonna say something completely different. I'm hungry. They're gonna say things that don't make any sense. But when we can give words to what we experienced and how difficult it is to find those, I call them moments of impact, that are hidden not just from us but from everyone else, and nobody has the language on those things. They could be, and I mentioned some stories in the book. There could be things, the way that your mom glances at you and not makes complete eye contact. It could be and I've heard stories, so many stories of just the most simple things, but only as an adult they were able to go back and ask themselves those questions.
Yeah. I'll give you an example, like for our audience who's listening. It's funny how these things will hide themselves until your child's at a certain level of development. So
Yes.
you think you're good. And then recently I had the experience where one of my kids is really struggling academically. And for me, there was no choice but to be successful in school. Like there just wasn't. There was no room
Yes.
for failure in my home. And I thought I had dealt with it until like very recently, this has kind of like come up with one of my kids, and I can just feel like this prickly, like, why don't you just, and I don't say it, but I feel it, and which is why
Yes.
like you schedule an appointment with a therapist to be like, I obviously need to process some of this. But this feeling like, well, if you just studied harder, like if you just tried harder, and of course I didn't say that, we got her a tutor, but even noticing the almost lack of compassion in that moment, I'm like, I normally have compassion for my kids, what the
Hmm.
hell is this? And I'm
Yes.
like, I try very hard, and I'm like, oh yeah, like when you're a child, there were times I did struggle, with reading or math or something, but I wasn't allowed to show that,
That's
like you just have
right.
to work harder. And so there's loss of feeling like unconditionally loved in that moment.
Hmm.
And then I struggle to find unconditional, positive regard for my daughter in that
Yes.
moment. And I'm
Yes.
like, oh my gosh, like that must feel horrible for her. But
And
that's not
Tammy,
about her. It's about my loss of
yes.
feeling connection. And so it's a neat way to frame it as it's
Yes.
it's loss of feeling valued when I was young.
And that you would still be loved if you were not successful, or whatever success means to the parent versus to you. And actually, another invisible loss right here, as you're saying this, is that nobody asked you what success looked like to you as a
Mhm.
child. What would that answer bring to your life?
That's really impactful. Like this is such a beautiful frame when I do trauma work. I was like, we're going to reframe things as grief because and
Yes.
lack of safety, but that's grieving lack of safety or lack of feeling seen or witnessed or held in a hard moment, that grief carries on intergenerationally
Oh my God.
to its
Yes.
other.
And
Yeah.
and and not being asked the right questions. It's almost like there are hidden rooms in our lives because the parent, and I'm getting goosebumps again. I've never phrased it this way myself before. The parent didn't walk us into these different rooms to
Mm.
explore and discover our own wants and needs, our own feeling of joy or success. What is that? What could have been for you at the time? And we don't have the answer right now. You can find the answer to what it is for you today, or what it is, and talking about you, but for everyone who's listening at the same time,
Yeah.
um, and it's hard. And I think, as you talked about your child, and you said, where's your compassion? I think it's the, and you know this very well, it's compassion for
Mm,
yourself
yourself.
more than them, right?
Yeah, that's that idea of reparenting yourself that comes up. You see it in
Yes.
social media all the
Yeah.
time. And that's why I tell everyone here, like Tanya and I will say, like, we have our own therapist. Like, we have to do, if we're doing
Yes.
this work as therapists, we have therapists. And
Yes.
I was like, all right, like, time to make an appointment because these things hide themselves. Like, you're
Yes.
like, oh, I thought I dealt with this. And then it comes
Yes.
up and you're like,
Yes.
whoa, like that is something we need to kind of
Yeah.
revisit. So when we have parents right now who are listening, like I think all the
Yes.
mental health therapists are like, I'm really glad you're, bringing this up for parents.
Yeah.
So maybe they start examining this and maybe they read
Yes.
your book and start
Yeah.
kind of taking a look back. But what other kinds of things can parents do to support the self-expression in their children?
And I think it's almost like a dual experience. Every moment they support their own self-expression and support their own child's self-expression. The lessons, those aha moments that we get as adults when we are saying yes to what I call the original self, um, we can then understand what that would mean to our child. Because unless we see this in ourselves, it is impossible for us to know the impact that it would have to our child, to show that, acceptance for whoever they are. Because
Mm-hmm.
I wanted, and when I use this example, I wanted to, as a child, I wanted to be an artist from as long as I can remember. And apparently, according to and we'll talk about this too, the collective survivor voice, which I'm like, it's not just our parents surviving their life. It is our grandparents. It is the neighborhood. It is our social connection with everyone else. There's a whole survivor voice that is very collective. That collective voice was like, Christina, you can't possibly think about being an artist. How are you going to make money like this? That's not really a real job. You're a child. Of course you like art. For me, it wasn't just that. It was everything. It was everything. And it was not an option. It was not an option until I found the courage. And let me tell you, Tammy, as adult parents who, I mean, I spent a lot of my parenting years as single, raising my daughters, and then I remarried, and we had a blended family. And let me tell you, I have
That's
stories.
so do I. I have two stepdaughters and a biological son, so it's tricky. I always tell people,
Tammy,
I'm like, it's tricky.
we could have a whole other conversation just about that, and compassion for every parent who's listening on also raising not only their own children, their stepchildren, and my stepchildren also didn't, their mother also passed. That's how I met my husband today. We at a support group of spouse loss and parent loss. But it's like, it is such a complicated journey, and I think that we try to simplify it. I try to simplify it with the new words that I've coined, all the different processes and practices we learn as counselors. We go to school to learn all those things, but deep down it is about the parent more than it is about the child. And now I'm doing my MFA in painting, and let me tell you, to give myself permission to remove guilt, remove shame, remove all the collective survivor language words that came to me over the course of, I just turned 52, over the course of my life. To do this now, it took every courage. And imagine if we chose for ourselves what is right, then we will absolutely help our children choose what's right for them as well, even from a very, very young age.
Yeah, of course, the doorbell's ringing. I told you it was going to happen. I said it, and the doorbell is
It's
ringing. So
okay. You're a
hopefully we'll.
manifester. You're a great manifester.
Woo! So hopefully it's just done. We'll see. Luckily,
I didn't hear it, by the way.
oh, that's good. Yeah, the mic's
Yeah.
pretty good.
Yes.
We'll just, luckily they edit this, thank goodness. Okay, so tell us more about this collective. You brought it up a few times, this
Hmm.
collective survivor voice. And then I think
Yes.
I want to go back to this idea of like parents' projections, but because I think that's what you were on
Yes.
to. But let's talk about this collective survivor
So
voice.
I want to, and there's a lot of things I want to say, and I'm trying to summarize everything. But imagine within ourselves, I divided our self into three parts: the survivor part, which has helped us survive the hard moments, the moments of impact in our life from day one. The watcher part, that's the part that's wise and knows us better than anyone else. This is, Tammy, for example, your wisdom, the part of you that has all the answers, but that survivor part shuts down, rejects that wise part of you. And then the third part is the thriver self. That's the kid. That's the kid-like self that we were born with. I want to be an artist. Tammy, what did you want to be when you
Uh, a vet. Well, several things. I wanted to be a veterinarian, actually,
yes.
so that was my
Oh,
like first choice. And now I have just around an animal assisted therapy ranch where I do like my own vet work. So I was
that's
like, I
amazing.
figured it out.
You did it just like I figured it. I'm like,
Yes.
I'm gonna be an artist somehow with
Yeah.
all of this, But
Yeah.
so
Just
that's the thriver self. That's the part that is a kid and not only wants things and knows what he wants, but has fun doing those things. That's
yes.
and we completely. If I was to give percentage as adults, we have the survivor. That's 80% of our behavior, language, actions, thought looping. We have the watcher, which is Um, I don't know, 10%, and then the other 10% is the thriver, which very little. And actually some people don't thrive at all. They don't even know how that feels anymore. It has been shut down completely. So when I say survivor collective voice, is everyone we know around us, their main way of communicating with us is most likely their survivor selves, because
Mhm.
that, unfortunately, unless we do what I call mental stacking, reframing, like you said, you use, I mean, it's one of my favorite things to do ever, to reframe that survivor voice into the wise watcher voice and into a thriving action. Unless we are very mindfully doing that, we continue to not only behave as a survivor, but also receive the survivor mindset from everyone else around, teachers, parents, grandparents, friends, everyone. That's the collective voice. And if you look at the news, if you look at the social media, if you look at all, and you'll see that most people are surviving. That is unfortunately how we're living our life, and until we realize that that's not us, that's not the original you, that's not the you that you are here to be, and that we are stuck in what I call the waiting, which is the life we are living after the first few moments of impact. And it's in between that life and the life that we could have, where I can't tell you, when I started doing my art masters, I cried. I didn't know. I knew it was going to feel like this, Tommy, but I didn't know.
Yeah,
I did not
because
know.
you were living authentically, and I think that's what we're talking about is when we as like
Mhm.
parents have our unfinished business, which means losses we had where we didn't feel good enough, we didn't feel seen, we didn't feel heard.
Yes.
We then assume what unconsciously, please parents, you don't realize you're doing this, but we as
Yes.
all parents
That's right.
have this agenda for our kids because they are going to complete the things that we didn't get to complete as kids. They're going to be the superstar soccer player. They're going to be the straight A student. They're going to whatever it is that
Yes.
we didn't get to finish,
Yes.
and that robs children of their authenticity because that might not be in the cards for them. Like, what if they want to be, instead of a soccer player, they want to be an artist, or instead of a
Whatever. A
a
vet.
straight A
Yes.
student, they are an athlete, like
Yes.
what, are a musician. And we have this, I think we go into parenting with this unwittingly knowing we have this unconscious agenda for who we think our children should be. And when we aren't aware of that narrative, was which I think you're talking
Yes.
about, this
Yeah.
angst around, my child has to be this because otherwise I don't feel good enough as a parent because I didn't feel good enough when I was little because I wasn't allowed to be who I wanted to be. Then we take that out on our kids, and then of course, like, they aren't us and they
Eh,
don't have the same desires.
yes.
And
And we're
yeah.
afraid, and we're afraid for that. I mean, that's our survivor self saying, hey, watch out, because your kid is going to suffer the way you suffered. So make sure that they get that good grade, they go to that school, make sure that they don't make the same mistakes. But those things that we say do not come from who we are. And unless we are connected to who we really are, Tammy, I still have to reframe my parenting. And I have adult children. My daughter is just graduating in a couple of weeks and from college, and I heard myself say, honey, Make sure you applied for that job versus just that one that she's choosing because she loves to climb. She's a climber, and that I am sending her to a corporate job. And I caught myself, and I'm like, that's the thing. The survivor mindset, that survivor self, is very strong because we run on that code all of our lives. And I created this. Like I know this. This
I
work is
know.
in my DNA, and I just made the mistake yesterday.
Yeah, no, and that's why I really think it's important that we're clinicians and we're vulnerable with
Yes,
our audience of saying like,
yes,
yeah, we screw up all the time. This
all
is
the time.
it's
Yes,
innately programmed into all of us, and that
yes,
we have these losses in our childhood that
yes.
then are transmitted to the next generation. But I think the important thing is, and what I heard you say is you were able to, you said
Catch
it, but then
myself.
you're like, you caught it, and you're like, now I can go back and I can repair that.
Yes.
I can forgive myself and I can do better next time. But it's when we run on this unconscious programming that I think it becomes an Achilles, your
Invisible. It's
Achilles tendon.
invisible.
Yeah.
It's and that's why I was so certain about that word. It's so hidden. It's so invisible. It's we cannot see it, and that's the this unconscious survival way of living that we don't even know. And I always say, sometimes we think we live a great life, but it's not the right life. It's like you're born to be a daisy, but you're being a rose. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful flower, Tammy, to be a rose, but a daisy is not a rose, and it's not your destined path. And I'm so glad to hear you have this animal, you know, life that you this shelter, whatever whatever it is that you're doing. And I wonder, and I can see how much you love this as well, but I bet there's a different part of you in this portion of your life versus when you are with animals.
Oh, I'm a completely different human being. My husband made a comment about that yesterday, actually, and so did my mom. So it's interesting of being present and being just. I'm not that I'm not nurturing, but I'm more nurturing with animals for sure. And there's an attunement process that goes on. And it was the same thing. I went back and did some work, and that's why I wrote a book. Like the same thing, Tanya and I wrote a book, and I'll probably continue writing because when I was very, very young, I used to write books for fun. Like I'd be like 7 years old and making books, and I knew that was just in the cards for me down the road. And it took a lot of courage and vulnerability, as you know, to write a book. Like
Oh,
that's very vulnerable.
yes.
So, I mean, I think if we're giving parents maybe some guidance here,
Mhm.
is one, like do some healing if we think we're doing this. Is there any wounds that we're kind of carrying with us that we might be transmitting to our kids? But
Yes.
what are some other things that like parents could nurture their
Yes.
children's own, like if to help cultivate and unearth their
Yes.
children's gifts? Like what would you say to a parent?
Yeah, and so first, self-correct when you're afraid that something bad is going to happen to your child. If they go there to this play date, so we always say, "Be careful, be careful, be careful, be careful." That's again, you know, catastrophizing. Where be careful, don't do this. That language. If we can only try, and I understand, as you understand, this is very hard to not say, "Be careful." When you go there, child, you don't make sure this and that, make sure that, and we are just making a whole list of things they're supposed to be doing. Instead, what we can do is remind them to have fun. Actually, we don't. And maybe there's other parents better than I am, but I forget sometimes to tell my kids, forget about anything, just enjoy yourself. Apart from the
Yeah.
basics of like keeping them safe physically, I think just to have fun. And maybe that's the first thing we say. And then
Okay.
maybe just, if we can't help it, say and be careful of this, but more quietly. So the priority should be have fun, enjoy, listen to their words more carefully, make sure that um, every day, and I used to do this with my children, every night you spend some time. I call it the cleanse. The kids need to cleanse their thoughts and to just remove them from wherever they're living and just give them to us, or put them in a drawing, however they're processing. Make sure every day your child has time to process what's happened, to cleanse their thoughts. And I think listening, getting them to feel safe to share. And I think we don't realize how unsafe our kids feel with the people who love them the most in the world.
Mhm. Yeah, we can. Yeah, those parts of us come out. And I really want to preface it's a part. It is not who you are as a
Oh,
parent. It doesn't define you,
yes.
but there is a part. And that's what I like about your work. It talks about parts of us. It's
Yes.
not, you are not
Oh,
defined by the part, but a part,
yes.
we have to acknowledge that part, that it does exist.
And we're hiding, and by doing all this work, we are actually revealing who we are, who we truly are. And we are able to focus on not only on our own thriving, but our kids thriving. Our kids thriving? Was this a really great day for them? Did they laugh?
Mhm.
Did they have a good, and these are basic questions, Tammy, right? These are so basic, but we actually don't focus on those things at all of
Yeah.
us.
One of the ones that I do, I'm curious what you think about this, that
Yeah.
I do with my kids, because this was something that I didn't reflect on until I was much older, was I talk to my kids about what gifts they want to give the world. Like everybody has gifts, and those
Yes.
gifts are different depending on the person. And so I said, one of the pathways to living a really fulfilled life for you to, I say happy, but like content, you can use different words depending on how old your
Hmm.
child is, that you feel like just your heart's full, I guess, like is how I would explain to my 7-year old, is to find what your gifts are. And it requires a lot of trying new things to figure out
Hmm.
what you really love. And your part of your job is to figure out how to give that gift to the world. And that gift could be that you're good with animals, or you are a great musician, or you're a good teacher, and you don't have to make money doing this thing. But the idea is that's how we stay interconnected, is
Yes.
you were gifted something. And that is part of your journey, is to figure out like how you are going to give that to other people. And it doesn't have to be through school. And I am really careful not
Yes.
to tell my kids that, because people find their gifts to share in many different ways that doesn't involve transactional pieces with money or anything like
Yes.
that. So that's something that I really bring up a lot with my kids, especially with one of my kiddos who struggles academically. I'm
Hmm.
like, your gift probably has nothing to do with school, kiddo, but like start thinking about where you feel fulfilled, and where you just feel connected, and where you feel joy. Like you need to follow those. And I can't tell you what that is. Like I
No.
can't prescribe that to you. You only know that.
And I think that probably comes, and it's a very good question to ask our children, that comes from you figuring out about your own gifts. And that's you being able to see yourself and what you're great. And by the way, Tammy, I think you're someone born with many gifts. So I don't think it's for you. It's like a multitude of things. You will always be someone that will have three or four things on a on every day to what you give out to the world and to yourself. And I love that question. And also as you were speaking, I said to myself, another important thing would be to help grow our kids' intuition. And I'm not talking about it's spiritual, or I'm not talking about anything like that. I'm talking about that help them trust themselves with their own answers. Just like you said, you don't have the answers. We can reflect what we see. We can say, oh gosh, you look so happy today. What did you do? What what was so fun today? You just seem so happy. What's going on? Like pay attention to those moments versus, when they hurt themselves. So pay attention to the happiness that they carry and reflect that back. But ultimately they're going to be the ones to decide what it is that makes them feel really good, and they know. We all know from the beginning, but we forget because nobody's paying attention to that part of ourselves. Nobody's asking those questions.
Yeah. We're all struggling with feeling safe and seen, but we do that sometimes in inauthentic ways, because it's the only way to protect ourselves. That's what we think anyway. And then our kids end up falling into those same patterns.
Yes,
So,
it's
yeah.
and I don't know, how old are your children? Tell me.
They are 16, 10, and 7.
Wow, you have all the ages.
Yeah, well, at least they're not in preschool anymore. So it's, at
No.
least we have some regulation in our house. They can bring their feelings. So the feelings aren't quite as big now. They're a
Yes.
little more tapered.
Yes.
But now we get to have these deeper conversations, which I love about having
Yes.
kids who are at this age. That prefrontal cortex is online, so we
Yes.
can start having these reflective conversations and talking about purpose and talking about even spirituality or whatever it is. And they're starting to make like those
Yes.
connections now. So lots of open conversations that were never had with me.
And well, no, and that's what a gift it is that you give them. And I just want to say also that we will never be the perfect parent. That doesn't exist because we
No.
love our kids too much. So our survivor self will be coming out and say, make sure they have this, and make sure they have that, and that will be communicated. But as long as we have a watchful eye on that, and we're aware, as long as we know what we said, maybe we can change it the next day, and it's never going to end this journey, not for ourselves and not for our parenting selves. We will always be on this journey. um, it ends only the last day that we're on this planet or this earth.
Oh.
That's when it ends. Before that,
Well, this has been just like I did not expect this conversation. I wasn't
Re-
sure. Like you come in, I'm like, oh, I'm talking to a grief specialist. Okay, and then we had this just a really synchronous. Yeah,
yes,
there's some synchronicity here with our how we work, and
yes,
yeah, it was just it was lovely.
I love it.
So everyone, if you really love Christina like I do here, we're going to go, if you go into the notes of this podcast, into the description, you can find her work at christinarasmussen.com. You can go to the URL, and she has a new book coming out. It'll probably be out by the time this airs.
Yes.
So, and that is, which one is, hold on, you have several books here. And The Invisible Loss, right?
Yes,
That's the
that's the
one,
one,
Invisible Loss.
and it is a it's a class, it's a guidebook. It's basically you're gonna have to buy a journal to do all the exercises. I and a friend of mine who read it said, "You're putting me to work." Like, yep, this is what we this is the work, and it's gonna take time. It's not gonna be a fast read, you know.
But that's a really good thing, because I think, especially parents who are listening who are like, I can't afford therapy. Like, I don't have time to do this. And like, you know what? There are clinicians out here who create resources like this that will
Yes,
help guide you through your healing process, just kind of like they're there with you. But
yes,
it's through this book or through these exercises.
yes,
And that's going to provide some corrective kind of healing, corrective experiences there. So that's really good to know for parents who are like, oh my gosh, yeah, I got some stuff that comes up when I
yes.
parent. I'm like, okay, well, here's a resource, something you can work through. So I encourage our readers to go take a look at that, The Invisible Loss, and offer themselves maybe some inner child work that they, and some
Yes.
reparenting.
And I wanna just end by saying, our this is about us. This is that's our ourselves first, and then it's about our kids. Unless we connect with that original self, who we've been as a child, I think that it's going to be a much harder battle over the years. So this was awesome, and I knew we were going to have this conversation because of the work you
Oh,
do. I'm like, yes,
oh,
this is great.
you never know. I come to you walk into a podcast, I'm like, well, we'll see where this goes. And then sometimes, like when I'm not as familiar with someone's work, and then
Yes.
I am just so pleasantly surprised, being like, that was amazing. So this was one of those moments where I'm like, oh, well, that was a lovely way to start my day. So thank you so much for your time today. And I'm really looking forward to our listeners getting to digest this and find out more about your work. And I'm going to get on and buy your book as well, because maybe that'll help me with that stuff that's coming up with my 16-year-old right now.
Thank you, Tammy. Thank you for the good words, and I can't wait to get to know you. And I was researching you when I found out we're talking. By the way, this is my first interview out of many that are coming in the next couple of months. So you are starting off
Oh,
my
that's so
my
exciting. Well, it's such
podcast
an
tour.
honor.
So I knew whoever's going to be first meant for me, and that I will feel so great and to be on this journey. So Tammy, thank you for being that person for me, the
Oh,
first
that's
person
wonderful.
for this
Thank
journey.
Oh, it's an honor. So thank you so much for your work.
Thank you.